Why is this happening, boss? Need help then! Please, don't leave me here.
I can't help you.
But why can't I down?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. There's more here.
This means everything.
Here you are.
Thank you. All right, children, come get some.
The sky over Msuka did not just rain that Thursday afternoon, it mourned, as if the heavens themselves knew that a woman's world was about to collapse into pieces that no hands could gather again, and in a quiet corner of that forgotten town lived Inky, a woman whose life was built on small joys and fragile hopes, a devoted wife and a mother of 3 children whose laughter once filled the cracked walls of their modest home, Chibutsa the eldest at 12 with eyes too wise for his age, Adi at 8 whose smile still carried innocence, and little Junior who barely understood the cruelty of the world at 2, and their father Ubina, a hard-working Kiki driver who left every morning with sweat and returned with dignity, even if all he brought home was barely enough to feed 5 mouths. But love made it enough, until fate arrived without warning, cruel and immediate, as a reckless truck driver turned a routine day into a lifetime of grief, and by the time Inky reached the hospital, barefoot and breathless through the pouring rain, her husband's body was already wrapped in silence, covered in white cloth that felt colder than death itself, and in that moment something inside her broke beyond repair, because there are pains that do not scream but settle deep within the soul like a permanent shadow, and though the house filled with mourners the next day, with loud cries and louder promises, those promises dissolved like mist after burial, as Ubina's own relatives stripped away everything he owned, taking his belongings, his savings, even the dignity of his memory, leaving behind a widow and 3 children standing at the edge of survival, and the laughter that once lived in that house died completely, replaced by a silence that echoed hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Because grief alone is heavy but poverty makes it unbearable, and as the days passed, reality tightened its grip, the landlord's knocks grew louder, the children's school doors closed against them, and little Junior's cough became a haunting reminder that survival was no longer guaranteed, and so Inky began to sell pieces of her life, first her wrappers, then her husband's clothes, then even the mattress they once slept on, trading comfort for crumbs just to keep her children alive, until the day came when there was nothing left to sell, nothing left to give, and hunger moved in like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave, and at night when her children cried for food, she would boil empty water and whisper lies coated in hope, telling them rice was coming, buying time until sleep silenced their hunger, while she stayed awake drowning in tears no one could see, because the strongest mothers suffer in silence, choosing pain over watching their children starve, and slowly she made a decision that would define her sacrifice, to eat once every 3 days so her children could survive each day, turning her body into a battlefield between love and survival, and even when she found small work washing clothes and sweeping compounds for coins that barely meant anything, she wore a smile outside while inside she was breaking into pieces, because sometimes strength is not loud, it is quiet endurance in the face of relentless suffering. But that night, as rain returned like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost, and her children cried louder than ever, something inside her reached its limit, and for the first time, she stepped outside, collapsed onto the wet ground, lifted her tear-filled eyes to the sky, and whispered not with faith, but with exhaustion, asking if God was still there, because when pain stretches too long, even belief begins to fade, and in that moment between despair and surrender, her life stood on the edge of something unknown. Hunger is not just an empty stomach, it is a voice that whispers fear, screams in silence, and slowly consumes dignity, and in Inky's life it became a constant presence that never allowed her peace, because every morning she woke up not with hope but with calculation, wondering how she would stretch nothing into something for 3 growing children who looked at her not just as their mother but as their entire world, and the weight of that responsibility pressed on her chest like an invisible force that never eased, and though she continued to search for work, moving from compound to compound offering to wash clothes, clean yards, or carry loads, the money she earned barely scratched the surface of their needs, and often she was paid not in money but in leftovers that were barely enough for a single meal. Yet she accepted everything with gratitude because survival had stripped away pride, and slowly her body began to weaken from her decision to starve herself, her strength fading with each passing day, but she hid it behind forced smiles so her children would not see the truth, because a mother's greatest fear is not her own suffering but the moment her children realize she cannot protect them, and still she endured, even when neighbors began to whisper, Even when pity replaced respect, even when doors closed more often than they opened, because poverty has a way of isolating people, turning them invisible in a world that once acknowledged them, and yet within that darkness, her children remained her only light. Their laughter, though rare, became her reason to continue, especially Chibutsa, who tried to act like a man too soon, offering to help in ways no child should have to, asking questions about his father that she could barely answer without breaking, and little Audie, who still believed things would get better because children often carry hope longer than adults can, and Junior, whose cries at night pierced deeper than anything else, because a child that young should not know hunger, should not cry himself to sleep because there is nothing to eat, and each time he cried, it felt like a knife twisting in her heart, reminding her of her helplessness. And on the nights when hunger was unbearable, when the walls seemed to close in and the darkness felt heavier than usual, she would sit quietly, staring into nothing, questioning everything she once believed, wondering how life could change so drastically, how love and laughter could be replaced by pain and silence in a matter of days, and whether she would ever escape this endless cycle of suffering. But still she held on, not because she was strong but because she had no choice, because giving up was not an option when 3 lives depended on her, and yet deep inside, a part of her was slowly fading, a quiet surrender growing stronger with each passing day, until that stormy night arrived again, bringing with it not just rain but a breaking point, where desperation reached its peak and her silent prayers turned into a cry that could no longer be contained. That night was different because it did not just bring rain, it brought the collapse of everything she had been holding together, as the wind howled through the cracks of their small home and the rain beat against the roof like a relentless reminder of her suffering, and inside, her children cried louder than ever before, their hunger no longer something that could be distracted or comforted with empty promises, and Junior's cries were the worst, sharp and desperate, mixed with the heat of fever that made his tiny body tremble. And when Chibutsa asked the question she feared the most, "Mommy, when will Daddy come back?" something inside her shattered completely, because there are questions that have no answers, only pain, and in that moment she could no longer hold herself together, no longer pretend to be strong, and so she ran outside into the storm, collapsing onto the cold wet ground, her tears mixing with the rain as she poured out everything she had kept inside, her pain, her fear, her exhaustion, calling out to a God she was no longer sure was listening, because when suffering becomes overwhelming, faith begins to feel distant, and she cried not just for help but for relief, for something, anything to change, because she had reached the edge of her strength, and it was there, in that moment of complete vulnerability, when she felt most alone, that something unexpected happened. A voice broke through the sound of rain, gentle yet firm, asking a simple question that carried more weight than anything she had heard in days. "Madam, are you okay?" And for a moment she thought she was imagining it, because hope often feels unreal when you've lived too long without it, but when she turned, she saw him, a tall stranger standing under an umbrella, holding a bag, looking unsure yet concerned, like someone guided by something he could not explain, and though fear flickered briefly in her heart, it was quickly overshadowed by desperation, because when you have nothing left, even strangers become possibilities, and as he stepped closer, his presence carried a calmness that felt unfamiliar yet comforting, and when he asked again if she needed help, the words she spoke were not planned, not controlled, but raw and honest, asking if he was the answer to her prayers, because in that moment, he felt like the only light in a night filled with darkness. The rain had not stopped, but something in the air had changed, as if the storm itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold, and as Inky looked up at the stranger standing before her, drenched in confusion and desperation, she saw not just a man but a moment that felt like the thin line between despair and hope, and the man, who would soon introduce himself as Ikenna, hesitated briefly as though unsure whether to step forward or walk away, but something stronger than doubt kept him rooted there, something that had led him down that road at that exact time, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet sincerity that felt unfamiliar in a world that had shown her nothing but abandonment, telling her gently that he did not know why he came but felt compelled to, as if guided by something beyond his understanding, and when she whispered through trembling lips asking if he was the answer to her prayers, he smiled softly and knelt beside her, not as a savior but as a human being responding to another's pain, explaining that he was not God but perhaps sent by him, and those words alone were enough to break whatever strength she had left, because sometimes all a person needs is to feel seen, and without wasting another moment, he led her to his car parked nearby, the rain still pouring as if trying to wash away the suffering of that night, and when he opened the trunk, what he revealed felt nothing short of a miracle to a woman who had been living on Nothing, a bag of rice, loaves of bread, cartons of noodles, beans, vegetable oil, and baby milk, items so ordinary to some but life-saving to her, and when he placed them in her hands, along with money that felt heavier than gold, her body trembled not from the cold but from overwhelming relief, and she clutched those items as though they might disappear if she loosened her grip, whispering words of gratitude that could never fully express what she felt, and before she knew it, she found herself embracing him tightly, crying against his shoulder with the kind of release that only comes when pain finally finds an outlet, and Ikenna, caught between awkwardness and compassion, gently patted her back, unsure of how to respond but unwilling to pull away, because even he could feel the weight of what that moment meant, and that night, for the first time in weeks, the small house that had been filled with silence and hunger came alive again, as the children gathered around eagerly, their eyes lighting up at the sight of real food, hot noodles steaming in bowls, bread spread with butter, and laughter slowly replacing the cries that had once filled the space, and little Junior, too young to understand the depth of what had happened, simply enjoyed the moment, licking the pot clean and declaring it the best meal he had ever had, while Chibutsa looked at his mother with quiet certainty and whispered that God had not forgotten them, words that pierced deeper than anything else, because they carried a truth she had almost lost faith in, and as the night settled and her children slept peacefully with full stomachs, something inside Inky began to shift, a small fragile spark reigniting within her, not strong enough to erase her struggles but enough to remind her that hope, though delayed, was not gone, and yet what she did not know was that this moment was not just an ending to her suffering but the beginning of something far greater, because sometimes help does not come once and disappear, sometimes it stays, sometimes it grows, and sometimes it changes lives in ways no one expects, and as the rain finally began to soften, the storm that had once symbolized her pain slowly transformed into a symbol of renewal, marking the night when everything began to change. Morning arrived gently, as though the world itself had decided to be softer after the cruelty of the night before, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the small house in Msuka woke not to the sound of hunger but to the quiet comfort of satisfaction. As the children stirred from sleep with full stomachs and lighter hearts, and Inky, though still carrying the weight of her struggles, felt something unfamiliar resting within her chest, a fragile sense of peace that had been absent for far too long, and as she stepped outside, drawn by the faint but unmistakable aroma of freshly fried akara drifting through the air, she was met with a sight that made her pause in disbelief, because standing there once again was Ikenna, holding a food flask and bottles of clean water, his presence as calm and unassuming as it had been the night before, yet carrying with it a quiet consistency that made it feel less like coincidence and more like intention, and for a moment she simply stared at him, unsure whether this was real or just a fleeting continuation of hope that would soon disappear like everything else had, but when he greeted her with a slightly embarrassed smile and explained that he had come to check on them, her doubts began to soften, replaced by a growing realization that perhaps this was not just help, but genuine care, something she had not experienced since her husband's passing, and though she tried to insist that he had already done more than enough, he gently dismissed her words, explaining that he understood what it meant to suffer without help, revealing a piece of his own past that carried pain, the loss of his sister to poverty because no one had come in time, and in that moment, the connection between them deepened beyond that of a stranger and someone in need, because pain has a way of recognizing itself in others, and compassion often grows from wounds that never fully heal, and as they spoke, a quiet warmth began to form, subtle yet undeniable, as if two lives that had once moved separately were now slowly aligning, not through grand gestures but through small acts of kindness that carried immense meaning, and when she asked if he was married, her voice carried a softness that even she did not fully understand, and his laughter, light and genuine, brought a moment of ease into a life that had been filled with tension, and though the conversation was simple, it carried something deeper beneath the surface, something neither of them fully acknowledged yet both could feel, and as days began to pass, Ikenna did not disappear as she had feared, instead he returned again and again, sometimes with food, sometimes with small amounts of money, and sometimes with nothing but his presence, which in itself became a form of support that mattered just as much, and slowly, the house that had once been defined by silence and suffering began to transform, not completely, but enough to remind them what life could feel like beyond survival, and Inky, who had grown used to hiding her pain behind a smile, found herself smiling without effort, laughing in moments she did not expect, and feeling a sense of relief that allowed her to breathe more freely. And even the children began to trust this man who had entered their lives so unexpectedly, seeing in him not just a helper but a figure of stability, someone who showed up when others had walked away, and yet despite all of this, Inky remained cautious in her heart, because Life had taught her that good things do not always last, that hope can be as fragile as it is powerful, and while she was grateful beyond words, a small part of her feared the day this too might end, because losing something once is painful, but losing it twice can break a person completely, and still, she allowed herself to accept what was being given, to live in the moments of kindness without questioning them too deeply, because sometimes survival is not just about enduring hardship, but also about allowing yourself to feel hope when it finally arrives. And as the days continued, one thing became clear: this was no longer just an act of charity, it was the beginning of a connection that neither of them could ignore, a quiet transformation unfolding in the most unexpected way. Time did not suddenly erase all the pain Inky had endured, but it began, slowly and almost quietly, to reshape it into something new, something that no longer felt like an endless punishment but like a story still being written. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the presence of Ikenna in their lives became more than just an unexpected blessing, it became a steady foundation upon which something stronger could grow, because he did not just bring food or money, he brought consistency, something far more valuable than a single act of kindness, and in a world where people had made promises and disappeared, he remained, showing up not out of obligation but out of genuine care, and that alone began to heal parts of Inky that she had long believed were beyond repair, and gradually she started to regain pieces of herself, her strength returning not all at once but in small moments, in the way she laughed more freely, in the way she stood a little taller, in the way she began to believe again that her life was not over, and with Ikenna's encouragement, she found the courage to start something of her own, a small food business, cooking and selling akara and simple meals by the roadside, using not just the resources he provided but the determination that had always lived within her, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And though it was not easy, nothing about her journey ever had been, she pushed forward with a resilience that had been forged through suffering, and slowly, her efforts began to bear fruit. Customers returned, her earnings grew, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a sense of independence that restored her dignity, and her children too began to experience a different life, returning to school, laughing more often, dreaming again without the constant shadow of hunger hanging over them, and in those moments, Inky would sometimes pause and look at them, overwhelmed not by pain but by gratitude. Because she understood more than anyone how close they had come to losing everything, and yet somehow, they had found their way back, not through miracles that fell from the sky, but through the simple yet powerful act of one person choosing to care. And as her bond with Ikenna deepened, what had once been a connection born out of circumstance began to grow into something more meaningful, built on trust, shared pain, and quiet understanding, and though neither of them rushed to define it, the love that slowly formed between them felt real, not like the fragile happiness of the past, but something steadier, something that had been tested by hardship and had survived. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon casting a warm golden glow over the small town that had witnessed her darkest days, Inky stood outside her now lively home, watching her children play, their laughter echoing into the distance, and she realized that while she had once asked if God was still there, the answer had not come in the way she expected. It had come through a person, through kindness, through timing that felt almost impossible to explain, and in that moment, she understood something that would stay with her forever, that sometimes help does not arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it arrives as a human being who simply chooses not to walk away, and as she turned to see Ikenna standing beside her, smiling quietly as if he already knew what she was thinking, she felt a peace that no amount of money could buy, because her life, once defined by loss and suffering, had transformed into something filled with hope, resilience, and new beginnings, and though the scars of her past would always remain, they no longer defined her, they became proof of her strength, reminders of how far she had come. And as the night settled gently over Msuka, no longer heavy with sorrow but calm and full of promise, Inky finally allowed herself to believe not just in survival, but in living again, because sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of another, one written not in pain, but in hope.